My parents kicked me out for studying programming. 6 years later, I bought the family home, and now they're my tenants paying tripled rent they never saw coming. I'm 28 years old. I run my own tech company, and what I'm about to tell you sounds like one of those revenge stories you read on the internet and think, this can't be real, but I swear every word is true. 6 years ago, when I was 22, my parents literally kicked me out of the house because I told them I wanted to study programming instead of business. And yes, you read that right, they kicked me out for that. What happened after? Well, it's a long story, but the short version is that I ended up buying the house where I grew up and becoming my own parents' landlord. Sounds like poetic justice, right? But the truth is more complicated than that. And I need to get it all out because even though externally it looks like I won, inside I'm still processing everything that happened. I guess I should start at the beginning. I grew up in an upper middle class home. You know, the type of family where everything looks perfect from the outside, but inside there's a ton of pressure and expectations. My father, Norman, was like 52 years old back then. Worked in finance or something like that. I never understood exactly what he did, but he made good money and loved reminding everyone of it. My mother, Virginia, was 49, and basically her job was to be the perfect wife and make sure I met all my father's expectations. For as long as I can remember, the conversation in the house always revolved around my future in business. Norman constantly repeated that I was going to take over his investment portfolio someday, that I was going to be his partner, that we were going to build an empire together. And I, being a kid, just nodded because that's what was expected of me. Since I was 14, when I discovered I could do incredible things with a computer, I knew I wanted to dedicate myself to technology. I spent hours teaching myself to code, watching YouTube tutorials, building small projects, but every time I mentioned anything related to computers, my father would roll his eyes and say something like, "That's fine as a hobby, Gabriel, but serious business is something else." My mother always backed him up, saying technology was for people who didn't know how to make real money, that programmers were basically glorified employees. Looking back, I should have seen the signs of how inflexible they were, but you always think parents will support you in the end. You know what I mean? When I graduated high school, I wasn't even allowed to choose my major. Norman had already enrolled me at the university where he studied, in the business school, and I just accepted it. I think part of me still hoped that if I showed them I was a good son, eventually they'd let me do what I wanted. I spent 2 years studying business administration, getting good grades because I'm a good student in general, but dying inside every day that passed. Meanwhile, I kept learning programming on my own, working on personal projects until 3 in the morning, basically living a double life. During that time, I met Danielle in an economics class. She was studying graphic design and was like a breath of fresh air in the middle of all that family pressure. I told her everything, about my parents, about how I really wanted to program, and she told me I had to be honest with them, that I couldn't live the life others wanted for me. There was also Spencer, my best friend since high school, who told me the same thing. They both gave me that support I didn't find at home, and honestly, I don't know what I would have done without them at that time. Spencer was studying music, and his parents supported him completely, even though it wasn't exactly a safe career, and I envied him so much for that. So, at the end of my second year of college, I was 22, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I had completed a software project on my own that had taken me months, an application that solved a real problem, and I felt like if I kept pretending I cared about corporate finance, I was going to go crazy. So, I made the decision. One night at dinner, because in my house important conversations were always at dinner, with all the formality in the world, I told my parents I wanted to change my major to computer science. I didn't present it as a question, you know. I said it as a decision I had already made. I think that was my first mistake. I should have approached it differently. But at that moment I felt I needed to assert myself. My father's reaction was, well, it was like watching a pressure cooker explode. He was silent for a few seconds, which was worse than if he had started yelling immediately, and then he dropped his fork and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. He said something like, "After everything we've invested in you, this is how you repay us?" And I tried to explain to him that it wasn't personal, that I just wanted to follow my passion, that I could be successful doing what I loved. But he didn't want to listen. He started saying I was ungrateful, that I was throwing away my future for a whim, that programmers were just modern factory workers, and that he hadn't raised his son to be someone else's employee. My mother, Virginia, didn't help at all. Instead of trying to calm the situation, she started with her own speech about disappointment, about how all her friends asked about my progress in business school, and now what was she going to tell them? That her son was a computer nerd. She used those exact words. I remember it perfectly because it hurt more coming from her than from my father. I tried to stay calm. I showed them my project. I explained that the tech industry was the future, that there were more opportunities there than in traditional finance, but it was like talking to a wall. The argument went on for hours. In the end, my father dropped the ultimatum that changed everything. He told me that if I wasn't willing to continue with the career they had planned for me, then I had no place in his house. He literally said, "If you want to throw your life in the trash, do it, but don't do it under my roof." And I, being young and stupid, said fine, that if that's how it was going to be, I'd rather follow my dreams without their support. I think I expected them to regret it the next day, that it was just an empty threat made in the heat of the moment, but it wasn't. The next morning, my father came into my room at 7, woke me up and told me, "You have until this time tomorrow to get all your stuff out of here." My mother was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, nodding her head. There was no conversation, no last chance for reconciliation, nothing. I spent that day in shock, packing my things in boxes and suitcases, still half expecting someone to say, "Just kidding, we're not really going to kick you out." But no one said anything. Danielle came to help me, and I remember she was angrier than I was, telling me my parents were monsters, that she couldn't believe what was happening. I called Spencer that night, completely desperate, and without hesitation, he told me I could stay at his apartment. He lived alone in a small studio near the university, basically a room with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom. But for me at that moment, it was a lifeline. The day I moved out, I loaded all my stuff into Spencer's car. He had an old Honda Civic from 2010 or something, and my parents didn't even come out to say goodbye. My mother was looking through the living room window. I saw her when I was putting the last box in the car, but she didn't open the door, didn't say anything. And that image stayed with me, like, your own mother watching you leave and she doesn't even have the decency to say goodbye. The first months living with Spencer were, well, total chaos. We shared a mattress on the floor because there wasn't space for 2 beds, and I tried to take up as little space as possible because I felt super guilty about invading his life like that. But Spencer never made me feel bad about it. He was incredible in that sense. The big problem was money. My parents had paid for my university up to that point, but obviously that was over when they kicked me out. I had some money saved from summer jobs, but it wasn't nearly enough to pay tuition for computer science. I tried to apply for student loans, but the process was complicated and required information from my parents that they refused to give me. I sent them emails, text messages, calls, everything. My father blocked my number after a week. My mother responded once, saying that if I wanted their help, I knew what I had to do. Eventually, I had to make the hardest decision of my life up to that point: leave university. I couldn't afford it, simple as that. Spencer offered to lend me money, but he didn't have much either. And I wasn't going to ruin his financial life, too. Danielle suggested I talk to university counselors, but they all told me basically the same thing, that without my parents' support or without established credit, there weren't many options. So I formally withdrew at the end of that semester. I remember filling out the withdrawal forms and feeling like I was signing my death sentence. Like I was confirming that my parents were right, that I had thrown my life away. I urgently needed money because I couldn't keep being a burden on Spencer, so I started looking for work. And this is where you realize how little an incomplete college degree in business is worth. I applied to like 50 different places, from retail stores to offices, and nothing. I finally got a job at a place called Sunnyside Diner, an American food restaurant, one of those that's open 24 hours and eternally smells like frying oil. The manager, Theodore, was an older guy, like 60 years old, kind of grumpy but good-hearted deep down. He hired me to cook, basically make burgers, fries, that kind of thing. The job paid minimum wage, and I worked 8-hour shifts that left me exhausted and smelling like grease all the time. But even that salary wasn't enough to help with rent and cover my basic expenses. Spencer insisted I not worry about rent, but I couldn't live like that, feeling like a permanent burden. So Theodore mentioned he knew someone looking for a night security guard for an office building, and they paid decently considering you basically just had to be there and make sure no one stole anything. I took that job too, so my routine became this: work at the diner from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., sleep a couple of hours, and then go to the office building from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was an unsustainable schedule, I know, but I needed the money, and at that moment I felt I had no other choice. Danielle saw me maybe once or twice a week, and she was always worried I was going to get sick or collapse. She was right to worry, honestly. There were times I literally fell asleep standing up while cooking at the diner, or had to. I have like 4 cups of coffee during my security shift just to stay awake. I was basically living on pure caffeine and diner food, which they give you free if you work there. It was like my only benefit. I lost like 10 kilos in those months. Not because I wanted to, but because I simply didn't have time or energy to eat well. Spencer told me I had to take care of myself. But how? I didn't have time, I didn't have money, and I felt like if I stopped even for a second, everything was going to fall apart. What kept me sane was that in my scarce free moments, I kept learning programming. I brought my old laptop to the security job, and while I was sitting at the reception desk in the empty building, I took free online courses, read documentation, practiced code. Sometimes I even ran out of internet and used tutorials I had downloaded previously. It was my way of not losing sight of why I had gone through all this. You know what I mean? If I was going to sacrifice so much, it had to be for something. And then something happened that, looking back, was the turning point of this whole story. One day at the diner. I had been working there for about 6 months. A regular customer named Jonathan came in. He was a guy about 35 years old, always came with a laptop and sat down to work while drinking coffee after coffee. I had never talked to him much beyond taking his order, but that day he was doing something on his computer and it crashed right when I was bringing him his food. He started complaining out loud about a technical problem he had, something about a database that wasn't syncing correctly. And I, without thinking much about it, gave him a suggestion on how he could fix it. He stared at me with a surprised face and asked me how I knew about that. I told him briefly that I had studied programming on my own, that it was something I was passionate about. Turns out Jonathan worked at a tech startup, a small company that was growing and needed people with its skills. He asked me if I had a portfolio, projects I could show, and luckily I had some things on GitHub that I had been building in my free time. I gave him my information, and honestly didn't expect him to contact me. You know, it was a random encounter at a diner. These things don't turn into real opportunities. But he called me 2 days later. He asked me to come to an interview at his office, that they wanted to see if I could be a good fit for an entry-level position on their IT team. The interview was weird because I arrived straight from the diner, still in uniform and smelling like burgers, super aware that I didn't fit in that modern startup environment with its glass walls and ping-pong tables. But they asked me some technical questions, and apparently I impressed enough because they offered me the position right there. It was a part-time job initially, paid a little more than the diner, but not much, working in tech support basically, helping solve software problems and keeping systems running. I accepted immediately and quit the diner that same week. Theodore was cool about it, told me he was glad I found something better, that he always knew I wasn't going to be there forever. But I kept the night security job because I still needed that extra income, so my life continued to be exhausting. Only now, instead of smelling like grease all the time, I spent my days solving technical problems. And honestly, I loved it. Every day I learned something new, worked with real technology, applied everything I had studied on my own. My direct boss, Veronica, was like 40 years old and basically a tech genius, and for some reason she decided to take me under her wing and teach me everything she could. The first months were difficult because I was learning so much and so fast, but I was also proving I was good at this. Veronica started giving me more complex projects, included me in client meetings, asked my opinion on technical decisions. After about 6 months, she offered me a full-time position with a decent salary, not incredible, but enough to finally leave the security job and start living like a normal person. I was finally able to rent my own apartment, a small studio but mine, and even though Spencer told me there was no problem with me staying with him, I needed that space of my own, you know? I needed to feel like I was moving forward, that I wasn't just surviving but actually building a life. Danielle and I became more serious during that time. She graduated from graphic design and started working at an agency, and we had this super nice dynamic of two people who were building their careers from the ground up, supporting each other. I still wasn't talking to my parents, not a word in over a year at that point, and honestly, there were days I missed them and days I hated them. It's weird, right? You can be angry at someone and still miss them. Danielle told me that eventually I had to process all that, maybe with therapy, which obviously I couldn't afford, but I just wanted to focus on moving forward. Things at work kept getting better. Like a year and a half after being there, they assigned me to an important project with a big client of the company. It was basically redesigning and modernizing their entire internal management system. A massive project that was going to take months. Veronica put me in charge of the technical team, which was crazy considering I was one of the youngest there. But she trusted me, and I didn't let her down. I worked like I had never worked before, coordinating with the team, solving complex problems, communicating directly with the client. There were nights I stayed until 3 in the morning debugging code, but it was different from when I worked security, you know? I did it because I cared, because it was my project, my responsibility. When we finally delivered the project, the client was super happy. So much so that they wrote a formal letter to our company, specifically praising my work and the team's. Veronica called me to her office and told me she was incredibly proud of me, that I had demonstrated not only technical skill, but leadership, and that the company wanted to recognize that with a promotion and a significant salary increase. At that moment, I was like 25 years old, and I was making more money than I ever thought I would make so young. I called Spencer and Danielle to celebrate, and I remember that night I realized something. I had proven my parents were wrong. I wasn't a failure. I hadn't thrown my life away. I had found my path and it was working. But also, and this is what I didn't tell anyone at that time, there was a part of me that wanted to rub this in my parents' faces. I wanted them to see what I had achieved without their help. I wanted them to know that their rejection hadn't destroyed me. It's an ugly feeling, I know, but it was real. I thought about contacting them several times, sending them a message like, "Look, I did it without you," but I never did. Danielle told me it wasn't worth it, that those people had shown me who they really were, and that I should move on with my life without them. The next 2 years were of constant growth. I kept climbing in the company, handling increasingly larger projects, making more money, building a reputation in the industry. But I also started to feel like I had hit a ceiling at that company. It was a medium-sized startup, and although they valued me, there were limitations to how much I could grow there. So I started toying with the idea of starting my own business. Veronica, honestly, encouraged me. She told me I had everything necessary to run my own company, that I knew the business, that I had the technical and leadership skills, that I just needed to take the leap. So at 26, with my savings and a small bank loan, because by then I had established credit and a solid work history, I started my own consulting company. It was terrifying. I'm not going to lie. The first months I basically didn't sleep, doing everything myself, looking for clients, doing the technical work, handling the administrative part. Spencer helped me with the website. Turns out he had learned web design as a hobby. Danielle helped me with branding and marketing, and slowly we started getting clients. They weren't big companies at first. They were small businesses that needed help with their technology infrastructure. But each client was a success. Each completed project was validation that we could do this. The company grew faster than I expected. I hired my first employee after 6 months, then another, and another. After a year, we had a team of 8 people and were working with medium-sized clients who paid well. After 2 years, I had 20 employees, and we had secured contracts with a couple of large companies. The growth was exponential, and honestly, sometimes I couldn't believe this was real. That I was the owner of a successful company at 28 years old. We moved to a real office, with a conference room and everything, and I remember the day we put our logo at the entrance and thinking, how the hell did I get here? The money I was making was something I never imagined. I wasn't a millionaire or anything, but I was very comfortable financially. I bought a new car. Nothing extravagant, but new. I moved to a much better apartment. I could go out to dinner without having to check the price of each dish. Danielle and I started talking about a future together, about maybe getting married eventually. Everything was going well, too well, and there was this constant feeling that something had to go wrong because life isn't that perfect, you know what I mean? And then, like 6 months ago, I was randomly scrolling on Facebook on a Sunday morning, and I saw something that froze my blood. A post from a real estate agency about a house for sale, and I recognized the house immediately. It was the house where I grew up, my parents' house. The post said something about investment opportunity, family needs to sell fast. I stared at the screen for like 10 minutes, unable to process what I was seeing. My parents were selling the house? Why? Were they in financial trouble? Part of me wanted to close Facebook and forget I had seen that, but another part, the dark part, that had been holding a grudge for 6 years, saw an opportunity. I called the real estate agent that same day, using a work number so they couldn't connect the call directly to me. I asked about the property, how much they were asking, why they were selling. The agent explained to me that the owners had had some financial difficulties and needed to liquidate the property soon. He gave me a price that was high but not impossible, considering the market. I asked him if the owners would be willing to a sale-leaseback arrangement where they could continue living in the house as tenants after selling it. The agent said they probably would, that it would give them more time to find another place. I spent the next few days thinking about this constantly. Should I do it? Was this revenge or justice? Danielle, when I told her, was worried. She told me she understood why I would be tempted, but that I had to think carefully about whether this was going to bring me peace or just open old wounds. Spencer, on the other hand, said something like, "Bro, if you can do it, do it. Those people don't deserve your compassion." I was conflicted for days, literally losing sleep over this. In the end, I made the offer. I used an LLC I had for investments, so my name wouldn't appear directly on the initial documents. I offered the full asking price, in cash, with the condition that the sellers could stay as tenants for a year with an option to renew. It was an offer they couldn't refuse, and they didn't. The sale process took like 2 months, during which I was super nervous that somehow they would discover it was me, but everything went smoothly. The papers were signed, the money was transferred, and I officially became the owner of the house where I grew up. I waited a month after closing before making my move. I sent them a formal letter as the property owner, scheduling a visit to meet the tenants and discuss the terms of the lease. The letter specified date and time, and it was a mandatory visit according to the contract they had signed. The day of the visit, I dressed in a suit, carried my documents in a professional portfolio, and drove to the house. I hadn't been there in 6 years, and seeing the entrance, the yard, everything was super surreal. The yard looked neglected. The facade paint was peeling. Clearly, they hadn't maintained the house well. I rang the doorbell, and my mother opened the door. She didn't recognize me immediately, probably because I was the last person she expected to see, and also because I had changed quite a bit in 6 years. I was fuller, dressed differently, had a beard. She looked at me confused and said something like, "Yes?" And I, in my most professional voice, said, "Good afternoon. I'm Gabriel, the new owner of the property. We have a scheduled appointment." I saw the exact moment she registered it, when her eyes widened and her face went pale. She called my father, practically screaming his name. Norman came down the stairs, and when he saw me, honestly, I thought he was going to have a heart attack right there. He froze in the middle of the stairs, grabbing the handrail like he was going to fall. I walked in without waiting for an invitation, technically it was my house now, and sat on the living room couch, the same couch where we had had that disastrous dinner 6 years ago. I told them, in the calmest voice I could maintain, that we were there to discuss the terms of the lease and establish expectations for the landlord-tenant relationship. My father finally found his voice and started stammering something about how it couldn't be me, how I had gotten the money, that this had to be some kind of fraud. I showed them all the legal documents, everything in order, everything legitimate. My mother started to cry. Not dramatic tears, but tears of shock and humiliation, which was strange to see because she had always been so composed. I explained the situation to them. The current contract they had was for 1 year, but given that the original terms were temporary, we were going to need to renegotiate the monthly rent. I showed them a document with the new proposed rent, 3 times what they were currently paying. It was still within the market range for the area, technically legal, but obviously it was a massive financial blow. My father started yelling that this was revenge, that it was cruel, that I was a monster, and I just sat there, letting him say everything, waiting for him to calm down. When he finally ran out of breath, I told him very calmly that they had 2 options: accept the new terms and find a way to pay them, or terminate the contract and move out in 30 days, as stipulated by the termination clause. My mother asked me, almost pleading, why I was doing this. And that question, honestly, caught me off guard. I had planned this whole confrontation. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but I didn't have a prepared answer for that. I told them something about how they had taught me that family is conditional, that parents' love has a price, and that now I was applying those same lessons. It sounded more bitter than I intended, but it was true. I gave them a week to decide and left the house. The drive back to my apartment was strange. I didn't feel the triumphant satisfaction I had imagined. Rather, I felt empty. I called Danielle and told her everything. And she was worried, told me it sounded like I wasn't okay, like I hadn't found what I was looking for in that confrontation, and she was right. Honestly, I had planned this moment thinking I was going to feel justice, vindication, but in reality I just felt tired and a little dirty. My parents eventually decided to stay and pay the increased rent, probably because they didn't have many options. I've been the landlord for 5 months now, and our relationship is purely transactional. They pay rent on time every month, probably because they know that if they don't, I have all the legal means to evict them. They haven't tried to reconcile. They haven't asked for forgiveness. Nothing. And me, well, I'm still running my company, still with Danielle, still living my life. Spencer tells me I did the right thing, that I taught them a lesson in humility. Danielle is still worried that this is eating me up inside more than I admit. Last week I received the April rent payment, punctual bank transfer as always, and I stared at the number in my account thinking about everything that happened to get to this point. I won, I guess, in the sense that I proved to them they were wrong about me, that I could be successful without them, that I have power over them, now. But it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels complicated and sad, and like something I can't undo, even if I wanted to. And that's the whole story. As real and as confusing as it sounds.